And welcome back, everybody. Well, we live in a digital age, and we need to use all the resources we can to evangelize. But we got to realize there are some great, great benefits, and there are also some great, great dangers in doing that. So to help us navigate those waters, we have our good friend Noah Braden with us. Noah, as you know, is a former Presbyterian who became Catholic after a culmination of a 13-year search for the fullness of truth. He's passionate about metaphysics and relational apologetics. He also loves to investigate meaningful conversations. He's a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame, specializing in theology and moral theology as well. And he's part of a triumvirate of people that have been on the show. And they run crossthetibor.org, which is a Catholic community dedicated to support those who seek answers about the church. And Noah, welcome back to Hands-On Apologetics.
Gary, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. I always enjoy our conversations, and your intros are always so gracious. So thank you. And I feel sort of compelled to say also, I think that you've had a handful of our volunteer apologists on now as well. Chris Vitale, I believe, has come on at one point or another, and maybe Kyle Whittington as well, who's been helping us out. So just wanted to give them a shout out as well. Yeah, no, we've been really fortunate. We've gathered quite a motley crew of apologists, but each of us have our own, unique contexts and our backgrounds, and it's been really wonderful. We've all been able to kind of connect with different people in different ways, right? Which is one of the beauties of relational apologetics, which I know is a topic that you and I have spoken extensively about, and something that really drives our work at Cross the Tiber. So
short format. Digital, it's so hard to develop a relationship. I mean, Twitter, for example, just shooting out these little sound bites. It's hard to think, when a person's reading it, to picture them as a real living human being, right? That cares about them.
So I think you're touching on something really important, and I almost kind of like unpacked this right before we went on break, and then I realized the times. That's why I kind of like halted a little bit. So it's really interesting. So a guy named McLuhan, what was his first name? I can't remember. But if someone is following along, they can find it, no doubt, based on what I'm about to say. So this guy named McLuhan, who was a commentator on kind of the use of media. Marshall, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Marshall McLuhan. He wrote an essay talking about medium as the message, right? Like in his mind, like medium basically becomes the message. And he talks a lot about sort of the inherent qualities of the medium that we select and how that intersects with things. And I don't quite take it so far as he does, but I think it's worth noting that the medium that we choose inherently shapes the message that we're conveying, right? I mean, it just sort of has to, and I think that it applies all the way back to, the typewriter, right? It was observed somewhere else that I was reading about the typewriter and how that led to more of a staccato style of communication, due to just sort of the nature of the typewriter versus kind of long form script. So it's easy sometimes now to kind of view all of the old as sort of good and kosher. And then like now this kind of new brand is sort of an entirely new category. I don't think that's entirely true. And yet the digital aspect of it kind of changes some things about it. Like what we talked about earlier, the ubiquitous access, as well as I think the speed of evolution has certainly changed. But the point of all that being is I do think we need to remember that the form will kind of by nature kind of impact the message. It will shape it and it will shape the perception of it as a result. So to your point about short form content, I do struggle to see whether or not the net benefits of some of those short form engagements actually does lead to more relationship, more community. I tend to think it doesn't. It probably is to do with the nature of the short form content. I think you're right. I think you're right to actually talk about TikTok as well as Twitter. I do use Twitter, and yet I'm not sure that I've ever really seen genuine community cultivated as a result of it. On Facebook, while I've certainly seen my share of kind of vitriolic interactions, it's also been something that actually has allowed me to genuinely stay in contact with people, as well as kind of connect with people that I wouldn't, that has then led to Zoom calls, which perhaps is a more intimate, somewhat closer, more relational kind of style of engagement. And then ideally, though, I think that this is what's important to me, at least, is I think the direction of our use of media kind of is in a sense what can guide this. So what I mean by that is that if our use of the digital media is designed to point to those relationships. And I think even more specifically to in-person interactions, then I would argue that it's a good thing. When it starts to become an end of itself, I think that that's when more dangers slip in. I'm not saying it's like automatically bad then, but when it becomes this sort of ecosystem, sort of a self-contained ecosystem that you never need to leave, then I think we're talking about something different, because then it's replacing the in-person. It's not pointing to, it's not supplementing, aiding, but it's replacing. And I think that's something different. I think that's something that's particularly tempting in the digital age. I know I just said a ton, so sorry about that, but I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, there's so much on the table. I'm trying to think what to point at. I think you're right in that sometimes social media can give you a false feeling that you're actually part of community when you're not, right? Mm-hmm. Like you said, when it becomes a self-enclosed system where your whole world is like leaving comments, and you have the good guys and the bad guys, and you don't know either of them. All you know is from the content that's on the web. You might feel like, hey, I'm interacting with people and building relationships and so on, when really you're not, because there's a lot of anonymity. What do you want to say? You know, no one knows who's who. There's all these nicknames and stuff like that. It's very, it can be very impersonal.
Absolutely. So I was actually just talking with my wife about this last night, and something that I think is related. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, right, I think that's a very kind of scary situation for a lot of people. But I think there's going to be like two very distinct type use cases that we're going to see with this. And I think this applies absolutely to the digital communication and evangelization. I think we're going to see some technology applications of AI are going to be these entirely self-contained type things. Think more like virtual reality, kind of that type of situation where you entirely enter a new digital world. Like you can interact with it, you can interact with people, you can purchase things. That is actually concerning to me. I think that's something that we'll have to be very mindful to limit time, exhibit prudence, treat it like an immersive video game. I don't know what it is, but I think we're going to have to be very cautious about that. But then there's going to be the other applications that are going to be augmented type reality they talk about, where there'll be things that like you'll be going about daily life, and you'll be able to kind of access what you're already doing in new ways using the technology. So think like you're going on a hike, right? And you're lost in the woods, and you can look at your phone and it projects a map of your surrounding. Like it digitally projects a map so you can like find your way out of the mountain pass that you're on. These types of things that are like interactive with your environment, so to speak. But they're not replacing it, right? They're complementing it. They're sort of enabling natural interaction. So I think this is a really important thing. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Romano Guardini, but he talks a lot about technology and communication in his I think it's letters from Lake Como, I believe is the specific collection. But he talks a lot about the distinction between a sailboat and a steamroller. And he uses the sailboat as an example of technology used to harness nature in a sort of positive way. And he uses the steamroller as an example to basically kind of submit, make nature submit to your will. And he talks about how it's almost ridiculous to talk about the people who are driving the steamroller as sailors, because they're so separate from the actual act of sailing. They're more akin to a hotel worker or a restaurant worker. And he makes all these really interesting connections. So if we kind of use that analogy of like, let's try to adopt a sailboat mentality to this new technology rather than the steamroller, that's kind of, I think, a really helpful framework for like a principle that helps us kind of process these new technologies that are sort of rapidly, being presented to us. I don't know. What do you think about that? I really love that analogy. It's helped me so much.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Of course, the augmented aspect of technology is something that we're already experiencing now. It's like you said, GPS, search engines, things like that. It's essentially augmenting what you would normally do, searching a library or, looking at a map. I think the scary one, of course, is what you said, where it's more like a virtual world where you're not really sure. It could be very easy to get lost and think that what's real is not real. that I think poses lots of dangers, especially online, because it would be very easy. And this has happened over and over in social media, as people presenting themselves as somebody other than who they are in order to exploit them, so it's easy to get exploited.
There absolutely is. And it's interesting because as someone who is a big fan of literature and films, I'm certainly not going to kind of condemn a healthy degree of escapism, because I think there's something to be said about kind of learning about ourselves, through stories and through that. And then there's kind of those examples that you mentioned there. And I think that the really important distinction of what you're mentioning, I think you're right to be concerned about that, is that it starts to confuse you. Like, it starts to suggest that reality is something other than it is. And I think that to me is somewhat of the problem, right? Like, when you're engaged in a story, even a video game, right? And I think it needs to be done moderately, but even like a video game, I think in isolation, okay, fine. Like, you can immerse yourself in a story, whatever, and then disengage, and maybe it was a decent way to have recreation. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see what I think when my kids are older. But but then there's like this entire replacing of reality, where like I no longer exist in the real world as we know it. I exist in this digital recreation. That does unnerve me, because, as you mentioned rightly, people start to take on different identities. And no doubt, if you take on a different identity for long enough, I don't know a lot about the studies, but I would imagine you start to get confused about, what reality actually is. I mean, if you spend long enough time, in this alternate reality, so to speak, that you created for yourself, right? But this is a temptation for all of us, and it always has been. I think this is the interesting, like, human desire underneath it, right? Is like, in some sense, we always have wanted to like rebel against the proper order and kind of exert ourselves over nature, right? To use the steamroller versus, the sailboat type situation, and it's not always bad. I'm not trying to say that like the use of the existence of a steamroller is inherently evil or anything like that. I just think it's a helpful image. But it does really make you reflect about the purpose behind the engagement, as well as the amount of time and that self-containment kind of mentality or ecosystem that we talked about. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And, another thing, too, that can give false impressions is technology can be used to multiply messages. So something that maybe a small minority may hold may seem like a majority because of their social presence, right? And that could be persuasive, too. I think the new atheists, for example, atheism was, like 1% of the population before 9/11. Then the new atheists came, and they seemed like they were all over the place, but their numbers were really small. Yet for kids plugged into social media, it seemed like, hey, this is the majority, because it was all over.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, it's always worth noting that, I mean, small motivated self-interest groups are often going to have a lot more influence over kind of a large disorganized whole. So I think you're right to kind of call out that it can be used for good, but in the case that you mentioned, it can certainly be used against us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hear the music coming up. We'll hit pause right there. We are chatting with our good friend Noah, talking about the evangelism in the digital age, dangers and benefits. More to come.